Hello, students. Let's talk about socio-emotional development in young adulthood or early adulthood. So let's make these slides full screen. It'll look a little bit better that way, and let's get into the lecture for today. So we're talking about socio-emotional development in early adulthood, and one of the things that we'll bring up right now is actually attachment. You'll remember attachment from early on in the course when we were talking about young children. So it's kind of strange. You might think it's strange for a minute until I explain it. But partners in early adulthood actually fulfill some of the same roles parents did in childhood. Not all the same roles, and obviously new roles as well, but some of those same roles are fulfilled by partners, and attachment in early childhood is relevant in adulthood. We did talk about this a little bit when we were talking about children. Let's dive into it just a little bit more. So for a child with secure attachment, if you remember the strange situation, they'd be in the room, the caregiver would be there with them, a stranger would come in, and the caregiver would then leave after a certain amount of time, and you would observe the child's behavior. What would their behavior be towards the caregiver? What would their towards the caregiver leaving, towards the caregiver coming back, towards a stranger, all these types of things. So a child with secure attachment would use the caregiver as a secure base. When the caregiver is there with them in the room, the child will come close to them and then go out and explore toys, maybe look back to the caregiver. So using the caregiver as a secure place to come back to, get some trust, get some warmth from, and in a lot of similar ways, in early adulthood, partners serve some of those same functions. So with adult secure attachment style, they generally tend to have a positive view of relationships in general, especially where these are related to relationships as well, but specifically right now we're talking about romantic relationships, and we'll talk about the triangle theory of love in a little bit. So I'm trying not to confuse the words too much right now, but if you go and you learn about the triangle theory of love, you'll see how the terms I'm using now don't actually fit perfectly in how I'll describe the triangle theory of love later, but just as a disclaimer to get started off with. So for adults with a secure attachment style, generally they have a positive view of relationships and find it pretty easy to get close to others. So with that, they generally do count on their partner to be a secure base, to support them, to offer comfort, security, be someone to go to when they come home from a bad day at work or from a good day at work, and just share that with them, to them want to explore something new, maybe try a new hobby or a new kind of class that they want to take. They'll use their partner as a secure base to get comfort and warmth and support to go and do that thing, or maybe if they want to go travel or something like that. So that's what a child secure attachment will then tend to look like as adults. And like I mentioned back then, people with similar kind of attachment styles tend to kind of wind up together. So an adult with a secure attachment style will probably end up with another adult with a secure attachment style. Not always, obviously, it just tends to happen that way. If you're looking for someone who will be a secure base, if that's what you're expecting from a partner, and that's what a partner is expecting from you, it's more likely that you're going to match up and link up there. Obviously, other people might match up with someone with a secure attachment or even an insecure attachment, but it just statistically it tends to happen more where people with similar attachment styles match up together. So let's talk about avoidant attachment. In childhood, this is because a parent is emotionally unresponsive or even rejective. The child basically learns to avoid that parent, even though they might want the closeness. They might want that closeness from the parent, but they know they can't actually trust on that parent being responsive to them. So as that continues throughout childhood, again in childhood, attachment styles can change. Parent behavior and child behavior together can change, and that attachment style can change. But if that attachment style continues in this avoidant style, it will tend to lead to an avoidant attachment style in early adulthood. And so what that looks like in early adulthood is a person that tends to be hesitant about getting involved in romantic relationships. They're a little more standoffish about it. They become more distant from their partner a lot more easily. So they are able to kind of detach. They're used to not having that emotional responsiveness. And so if they sense that or think that's happening, they will be more likely to disengage quicker because that's what they've learned to do as a child and throughout their lifespan. So anxious attachment for a child, again, is being kind of nervous and stressed about the relationships. Or again, it's not a secure attachment. It's very anxious. They need a constant reassurance and affection. They have trouble being alone, have trouble trusting people in childhood. So that matches on to adult anxious attachment style in the sense that a person with this kind of attachment style as an early adult would demand a lot of closeness, but they'd also be a lot less trusting because they wouldn't know that they could rely on that. They might be more emotional, more jealous, more possessive of their partner. And so you can see how if you have two partners that are like this, that have this anxious attachment style, it might not lead to maybe a long-term relationship. It might have a lot more problems if both partners are less trusting in general and more emotional in general. Then that could be a lot harder to make work. Obviously that can be made to work, but it's just going to be a little harder than if they already have secure attachment styles. As we talked about before too, your attachment style can change even in adulthood. So let's say someone with an anxious attachment style was partnered with someone with a secure attachment style. As they learn that they can rely on this person as a secure base, that this person will be there for them, and over time they learn to trust that, they might change their attachment style to then be more securely attached as well. So it's more of the positive possibility. There's also the possibility that someone with a secure attachment could even develop an anxious attachment style. But let's hope it goes the other way, to the more positive ones. All right, so with that, let's talk about intimacy in early adulthood. And when we're talking about intimacy specifically here, I want to make sure we have this definition correct because we're talking about self-disclosure. I've brought up the term intimacy as we've been talking in other phases of life, but what we're talking about here is intimacy in the sense of self-disclosing your private thoughts. So who are you sharing all your inside jokes with? If there's one or two or three people that know all the inside jokes and you all know each other's inside jokes, you've been very intimate in this way with them. That's what we're talking about here. So that self-disclosure, if they know your secrets, your deepest, darkest secrets, your greatest fears or your greatest goals, that's what we're talking about intimacy here. Sharing things about yourself, the little things, the big things, everything in between. So this is relevant for Erikson because Erikson's stage at this point in early adulthood is intimacy versus isolation. And so mainly this intimacy we're talking about here is this self-disclosure. So Erikson thought that intimacy is finding oneself while losing yourself in another person. So that could, oh, my screen just went black. I wonder if it went black for everybody. So this is oftentimes related to romantic attachments. So Erikson thought this was a really big part of early adulthood. And so the failure to achieve that intimacy results in social isolation for Erikson. So that was kind of one of the key goals for socio-emotional development at this time. If you reach that goal of being intimate with someone, then you would be good. You could move on to the later stages. If not, you'd be in social isolation until you kind of met this goal mark, this, I can't think of the word or the term. Goal mark is fine. So the balance is to find that balance between intimacy and commitment and independence and freedom. So earlier in adolescence, there was a lot more separation from parents, trying to be more independent, find your own identity, and now trying to match up with someone as intimacy versus isolation. It was Erikson's idea. So, as we know, Erikson, as well as Piaget and other researchers, did a good job of making early observations, coming up with early theories, but we know there's a lot more to socio-emotional development for young people than just this intimacy, just finding that intimacy or being socially isolated. There's a lot of other aspects of socio-emotional development. One thing that your book almost entirely just ignores is friendships in early adulthood. So there's obviously relationships with parents, that's talked about a little bit in the book. There's relationships with partners, that's the main focus of the book, but that's also where most of the research is. So it kind of makes sense. People do care a lot about romantic relationships and finding partners and things like that. but the friendships in early adulthood are important. The work relationships, developing and starting a career, these things are all also really important aspects of early adulthood that your book kind of skims over in some of these cases. So we'll focus on a couple more of them here. And let's start that with Sternberg's triarchic theory of love. And so you might say, well, Professor Riches, you just said that we wanted to talk about friends and parents as well as romantic partners. And this actually does. So this triarchic theory of love, while its focus and the center of this consummate love, is talking about that love you would have with a long-term partner, these other aspects of love are types of love that you might share with siblings, with best friends, with uncles, aunts, close friends of the family, things like that. So these types of love that we'll talk about are all different types of love. So every aspect, every piece here is a different type of love, or is defined as a different type of love. So we'll talk about how these different loves are related to different people in life. So let's define some of these corners first of this triangle, then the sides and the middle as well. And I'm not going to go into tons of detail about every single point, but I do have a review video if you want to go over something that I haven't covered in as much depth. There's a couple that I want to pinpoint that cover like family and friends as well as romantic partners. So the three critical dimensions of Sternberg's triarchic theory are passion, intimacy, and commitment. So for passion, that's the thing that I think probably is easier to understand. Passion is physical and sexual attraction. So wanting to be physical with someone, that's passion. So if you're wanting to be physical with someone, you want to get them in bed, for example, that is passion under these definitions. You might have heard intimacy described in that way. Under these definitions with Sternberg's triarchic theory, passion is exclusively that physical and sexual attraction, wanting to be physical with someone. So intimacy is what we were talking about a minute ago. It's related to the emotional feelings of warmth and closeness with a person. So are you sharing your secrets with them? Are you sharing your hopes, your dreams, your fears? Do you have inside jokes with them? So these kinds of things, these are intimate. You're sharing things about yourself. That's intimacy in this case. And then commitment is, it can be small commitments, it can be really large commitments. So it's basically wanting to maintain that relationship even if problems occur. So the idea that you'll be there for the other person to help them and that they will be there for you. If we look at this from a romantic relationship, you might imagine marriage and a long-term commitment in that way to be an example of commitment. You could also have commitment to your best friend, or maybe just a close friend. Maybe there's a close friend that you meet up with for coffee once a week. So you are committed to that relationship. You are seeing this person once a week. That commitment is, you're maintaining that relationship. That's also another example of a commitment. So passion, that physical drive, that sexual attraction, wanting to be physical with a person, intimacy, sharing things about yourself, things that matter to you, things that matter to them, and commitment, wanting to be together, like in the same space. So going for coffee or sharing a house together, these kinds of commitments. So small to big. You can have smaller commitments than a weekly engagement as well. Maybe you see your friends every couple of years for a reunion or something like that, like your high school friends or something. So let's talk about some of these types of love. So here we have the intimacy, so that sharing of yourself, that passion, that sexual energy or wanting to be physical with someone, and that commitment is over here. And so these all have different names of love. So intimacy by itself is called liking. If there's someone that you're in a relationship with that you're just sharing things about yourself, they're sharing things about themselves, that can be a really fulfilling relationship. It might not involve any passion at all. Let's imagine this intimacy is with an uncle that you have just met and you are finding you really click with. There's a lot of things you share. You share different sets of ideologies that are similar and goals, things like that. Or maybe you're learning from them or something. You can be really intimate in sharing things about yourself. They can be sharing things about themselves, but you have no passion towards them or no commitment. Maybe you've just met this person. It's early on in that relationship. So you could have a friend relationship that starts with just this intimacy. You could have a family relationship that includes just intimacy. You could have a romantic relationship that starts with just intimacy, where you're sharing things about each other that you don't yet, or maybe you never even develop a kind of passion. So that's some examples, and it's called liking. So this type of love is actually called liking. So commitment by itself, this would be just someone that you're committed to, that you don't necessarily share your secrets, have inside jokes, tell them your goals or they tell you their goals. You also have no passion with this person. You don't want to sexually be with them at all. So one way I think about this is someone who's committed to maybe taking care of an elderly family member. Maybe this family member has Alzheimer's or something like that. They can't actually share things about themselves very well, and you can't really share about yourself. So you're still committed to them. You still have love for them, but it's not the same as you might have with your best friend, who you are able to be committed to, as well as sharing things about yourself. So it's called empty love, which is a little bit of a sad term to say. My example was a little bit on the sad side as well. But that by itself can also be fulfilling in different ways. And then passion by itself, that if you have just that passion, just that sexual drive to be with someone, that you want to be physical with them, but with no intimacy, so you're not sharing anything with them about yourself, they're not sharing about themselves, you've made no commitments to them, you just really want to be with them, they really want to be with you physically, that is infatuation. So that's passion alone, and that the term for that love, it's a type of love, it's just called infatuation. So you might see a romantic relationship with a long-term partner might start as maybe intimacy, it might start as passion, and then you might put those things together. So let's start putting some of these types of love together. Consummate love is the middle of this triangle. It's the strongest or fullest form of love, with passion, intimacy, and commitment all together into one. And so if you go to, say, a marriage and family therapist, or you're trying to build a strong long-term relationship with someone as a romantic partner, you're wanting, probably your goal should be to have this consummate love. You're intimate with that person, you're consistently sharing things with them, sharing your desires, their hopes, fears, your hopes, fears. You're passionate with them, you want to physically or sexually be with them. And then also commitment. That might take the form of cohabitating, that might take the form of marriage, that might take the form of you are partnered with that person, but you don't have any other kind of thing around that, but it's a long-term commitment with that person. So that would be consummate love, and that's intimacy, passion, and commitment together. That's kind of the goal for a marriage and family therapist. They might sit down with a couple and say, all right, so you're here because you need to work on something. Now, which piece of this triangle is missing? They probably wouldn't, I'm not a marriage and family therapist, but I doubt that's the first question that they would ask. Are you missing intimacy, passion, or commitment? Mostly because people wouldn't understand the definitions for intimacy versus passion, I would assume. But they would try to figure it out. Is this couple missing passion? Are they missing intimacy? Are they missing commitment now? And then try to work on building those things so that long-term romantic relationship would have all three of these things. So when we're talking about a romantic relationship, it's really the only one that would fit here in this consummate love. Versus a friendship could definitely fit in intimacy, family relationship could fit in intimacy, family relationship could fit in commitment. But let's talk about some other examples. So we've also got, I talked about infatuation. Affectionate love. So affectionate love is also called companionate love. It's a combination of intimacy and commitment with no passion involved. So let's look at that. So companionate love, here you have intimacy plus commitment, that's companionate. And you could think of that, who's a companion to you in your life? Maybe it's your best friend. Maybe you have absolutely zero passion or sexual desire for your best friend. Your best friend might also be your romantic partner, so that wouldn't necessarily make sense for this case. But let's say you have a best friend that you have no sexual desire towards. That might be companionate love. You share everything about your hopes and dreams and fears and goals. they're sharing those things as well. You're very intimate with them. You're committed to them. If they need help, you're going to be there. If you need help, they're going to be there. You talk on the phone or text on the phone all the time. So that's a good example of companionate love. So another example, maybe you have a sibling or multiple siblings even that you are really close with, that you share a lot about yourself. You're there for them, they're there for you. You might have companionate love with that person or any other friend. So a friend relationship could fit really well in there. And there is a fair amount of research on how to make good friendships, that you're sharing things, you're committed to that person. And we talk about that in some of the articles that I generally have students read for this class. All right, the last one I want to talk about is fatuous love, and that's adding passion and commitment without intimacy. So that would be down here at the bottom. So you are passionate with the person, you desire them sexually, you want to be with them physically, you are also committed to them. So generally this is thought of as, say, like a long-term commitment, but you have not been intimate with them in the sense that you're sharing things about yourself. So I think probably the easiest example to think about here would be a couple who has not known each other for very long, let's say 2 weeks, 2 months. I'm not trying to call anybody out here, but let's say you haven't actually had a chance to get to know, or this couple, this imaginary couple, has not actually had a chance to get to know each other. So they've not been intimate, they've not shared their goals, hopes, dreams, thoughts about the future, political ideology, anything, what religion they are. They don't know anything about each other, but they're really passionate, they're really sexually energized and want to be with each other physically, and they decide to go off and get married. So they're now making a really long-term commitment. They buy a house, I don't know, some sort of long-term commitment with this person that they don't really know that well. So I think that's the best way to think of fatuous love. You might be able to think of examples of contexts where that might happen or be more likely to happen. And I think I've talked about every single one of these except actually this romantic love one. I've talked about intimacy, passion, commitment, fatuous love, companionate love. All right, yeah, let's just talk about the last one, even though it's not in my notes. Romantic love is intimacy plus passion. So this would also be really something that you might see at the beginning of a romantic relationship. So you might have started with sharing a lot of things with a person that you just met. You find that you click really well, you're sharing things about yourself, they're sharing things about themselves, and then over time you develop this sexual interest in them. You want to be with them physically. At that point, we would start to call that romantic love. Generally, when we see romantic comedies, I do like watching romantic comedies. It tends to be this. You either have a couple start out as they have this passion, and then over time they start developing this intimacy, or they start with this intimacy. They know each other really well, maybe they've been friends for a while, and then they start developing this passion, this sexual interest in each other. So usually the end of the romantic comedy is when they then so a lot of the romantic comedy is the process of going through this romantic love. They have this intimacy, they have this passion, they're trying to navigate that, and usually the romantic comedy ends when they make some sort of commitment to each other. They get engaged, they start dating steadily, they make some sort of commitment. So it's now moved into consummate love. So much of romantic comedies that you might have seen deal with intimacy, passion, and this romantic love. So that passion and intimacy together, that's romantic love. So if you could imagine how any kind of relationship might develop. So let's take a friendship again. You might start off a friendship with commitment. Maybe you're on the same team as someone, so you're coming to practice with them. Maybe you're in a band with them. You don't really know them at all, but you're coming every day to practice. You're doing things. You're committed to this sort of relationship, whatever it is. Then over time you start sharing things with that person. Maybe they become one of your best friends, and for years and years they're a really good companion to you. So that's one example of how this love could develop. The examples I gave from romantic comedies, I think it's pretty clear what romantic love kind of looks like, and also how it can move into consummate love. So you can look at any relationship in your life and think about, well, what do I need to make this relationship stronger? So if you want a very strong relationship with a close friend, you might think, well, have I been talking to them as much lately? Have I been as intimate with them, sharing things about myself, learning about them? If not, maybe that's something to work on in that relationship. If you've failed on some of your commitments with that close friend lately, maybe that's something that you need to work on with that to get that to be a companionate love. So I think this triarchic theory of love is a really useful one visually, and it's pretty simple to understand as well, so that you can look at the relationships in your life, whether it be romantic relationships, relationships with family or friends, and really look and see, well, where do I need to build this? And then from that decide, well, what do I need to build, say, if you're needing to build intimacy, or you're needing to build commitment, or you're needing to build passion, what do you need to do in whatever relationship to build that, so you can get it to the goal that you want it to be at. So hopefully that makes more sense now. If not, there's other examples in this video than I used in class, but mostly this is a review from what I just talked about. So we're not actually going to watch it together right now. But it is a good video that goes over a couple different examples. The professor presenting that does have some other ideas. Other examples is the best way to say it. I just feel like I was saying examples a lot of times. So searching for a different word, but it was not coming. All right, let's talk about cross-cultural variations in romantic relationships just briefly. So most of those types of love that I was just talking about, those definitions can translate to other cultures. So the romantic love, companionate love, fatuous love. But even though we might call commitment empty love, and we kind of have that negative connotation, that might not be the same in other cultures. So a collectivist country, intimacy is more spread out to more people in the community. Generally, in a collectivist country, you are more intimate with more people, sharing more about yourself than sharing more about themselves. So there's more people that you have an intimate relationship with than in the US, for example. In individualistic countries, intimacy is generally for smaller groups. So me, myself, I've lived in an individualist culture my entire life. So the intimacy that I share, the things about myself, I only share with like 4, 5, 6 people total. So a very small group. That didn't even include my kids, but they're also really young, so they wouldn't understand a lot of my goals and hopes and dreams beyond I want them to be well and do well. So with that, there tends to also be a little more passion and more self-disclosure in those small groups as well. So with that, let's talk about early adult lifestyles. So I guess a main point here is there does need to be more research on sociocultural relationships of friendship, love, romance, those kinds of things. But there are differences between cultures, and there's differences in what's valued. So is that commitment more valued than, say, that passion is valued in the US? So single adults, in 2016, about 45% of adults 18 and over were single. With that, and that definition means that they were not married or cohabitating. So it can be challenging to be single, mainly because the culture that we're here in the US is very marriage oriented. There's a lot of focus on being married and being partnered with one person. So with that, it might be lonely to be single and can be hard to form intimate relationships. Let's take a really good example of this is someone who is actually asexual, who probably doesn't, or to a different degree, might not feel this passion for anyone at all, but might want this intimacy in multiple kinds of relationships. You might also find a polyamorous person who wants to have consummate love with maybe 2 people and really close companionate love with maybe another circle of, say, 5 other people or something like that. But like I said, the culture here is very marriage oriented, and so if you're single, it can be lonely, it can be difficult to form those kind of intimate relationships because it's not the standard, it's not the average, it's not the norm. So you're trying to be really intimate and share things about yourself and share things about themselves, and they might not want to do that because they're not looking at you as, say, a romantic partner, so there's no passion there. So that can be tough. So for single adults, there are some benefits to a single life. So we can look at, I'd say, the role model, not really, but just as a joke. So the role model for single adults, Barney Stinson. Everyone he knows is getting married or pregnant, but he is just getting more awesome. So How I Met Your Mother, good show. I kind of liked the ending. I didn't like the ending. I'm lying to myself. I wanted to like the ending. I didn't like the ending. Anyway, not relevant at all to this class. Maybe I need some more coffee to focus a little better. Anyway, now I kind of want to re-binge How I Met Your Mother. It's quite a lot of seasons. It's actually a hard one for me to binge. I don't have that much time to binge all, 8 seasons? Might only be 6. All right, so I should really take a picture of Barney Stinson off this slide if I don't want to get distracted by the show How I Met Your Mother. Anyway, so some other benefits of a single life are more ability to make autonomous decisions. Things that, if it's only affecting you, it's easier to decide, okay, yes, I am going to move across the world and start a job managing a hotel in Dubai. I had a single friend from high school who ended up doing that. He was working on a cruise ship for a while. He moved up the ranks, became a manager, and in the end, he actually got a job offer managing a hotel literally in Dubai, and moved over there, managed a hotel in Dubai for a few years. Then came and managed a chain of hotels in the US after that. So because he was single, it made it a lot easier for him to make those autonomous decisions than if he had to move with a partner or children in tow as well. So it does leave more time to pursue interests. Good example for that one, lets more time be for travel and can increase your privacy, especially if you don't have any roommates or things like that. So with that, for single adults, 40% have dated someone that they met online. I would suspect, because your book is a little behind in stats, because they get all the research, they edit, they review, then they print the book, and by that time it's at least a year after the research has come out. So I would suspect most single adults today, maybe even closer to like 70%. But again, that's just a guess. I didn't look up any articles. Maybe a good question paper if you want to look that up. See today what percentage of young adults have dated someone that they've met online. That would be good. So 24% have met through a friend. 48% had sex before the first date. So the idea with this is that millennials seem to want to know as much as possible before actually committing to a serious relationship. So they might want to get that intimacy and passion, see and make sure that that is there before they actually commit to something as a long-term relationship. So probably not what Ted Mosby did. When I created these slides, I wonder if it was during a time when I was binge watching How I Met Your Mother. But yeah, millennials tend not to be the Ted Mosby here, telling someone that they're in love with them on their first date. So cohabitating is living together in a sexual relationship with no marriage. So the cohabitation rate in the US is rising. With that, it is usually a lifestyle in and of itself. It's not usually, on average, it's not usually a precursor to marriage, like a test this out and then get married kind of thing. It's rare for cohabiting to last more than 5 years, but as we'll see in a minute, it's actually also a little rare for marriages to last more than 5 to 10 years. Maybe not rare, but that's about the time divorces tend to happen. So there is mixed results about cohabiting and then marriage being positive or negative. So some research suggests that if you cohabit before getting married, then you get married, that your marriage will be more positive. Some research says that actually no, it'll be more negative. So it's a mixed bag. I don't think there's enough data, or I don't think there's enough control over the variables to make sure that it's just the cohabitating that is making that difference. There's a lot of other factors. It's not just the cohabitating that's leading to positive or negatives in marriage. So for marriage in the US, the marriage rates have declined in recent years. So in 2014, about 20% of US adults had never married. And in 2016, the average age for the first marriage climbed to 29 and a half for men and 27 and about a half for women. So what that means is that earlier, so 2000, 1990, times before then, it was a little younger than that. So the lowest stat I've ever seen was like 1880 or something. And so the average marriage age still then was only like 25. So it wasn't very young, but it was younger than 29.5. So marriage in adolescence is more likely to end in divorce. So if an adolescent marries an adult, or two adolescents get married, that's a lot more likely to end in divorce. The average duration of marriage in the US is just over 9 years. Again, that's an average. So emerging adults tend to be optimistic about marriage and set goals to create a stable life and a successful marriage. So they're still trying to be successful, which is another one of those findings that's kind of like, well, of course, why would couples get married if they didn't actually want to try and have a successful marriage? Happily married people do tend to live longer, have healthier lives. So that's correlation. It's not clear if that's because of the marriage or because of the other support, having such a close social support that you're intimate with, as well as committed to. They feel less physical and emotional stress. I would be interested to see a study comparing happily married people and really close long-term friends. So people that you would say are really clearly in love companionately. So they have that companionate love and they're really committed to each other. They have a lot of intimacy, compared to people who have that commitment, intimacy, and passion together. I'd like to see a study comparing those groups to see if there really is a difference in adding that extra piece of that passion. I would suspect that there might be some differences, but I don't think it would be as big as looking at happily married versus not happily married. There's also a correlation with better cardiovascular health, and a happy marriage is a protective factor for other problems in life, like losing a job or other stresses. So remember, we talked about protective factors as keeping people kind of safe from bouncing towards negative outcomes. So most divorces happen between 5 and 10 years into a marriage. You can see that really big spike there, and then it kind of drops off. So if you've stayed together that long, just on average, you're probably going to stay together after that. So most divorces, I already read that one. So after divorce, there do tend to be higher rates of depression, anxiety, physical illness, suicide, and motor vehicle accidents. So a lot of those are correlational. Some of them might have some causal relationships there. There are a lot of reasons that people cite for divorce. So growing apart, arguments, lack of respect between partners, unfaithfulness or adultery, being married too young, domestic violence, different religious affiliations or changing religious affiliations, having divorced parents. It's another example of one that's definitely correlational. So having divorced parents isn't going to cause you to then be divorced, but it does increase the likelihood statistically. So a higher probability, that's the best word there. It doesn't increase the likelihood, it increases the probability. Actually, that might not be. You are at statistically higher risk of divorce if your parents are also divorced, but the parents' divorce is not necessarily causing. So this is correlational. Correlations are not causal. All right, so dealing with divorce. It can be difficult after divorce to trust someone else in a new romantic relationship. So the book gives these little points, and I think they're actually really good, which is why I just copied and pasted them into this slide. So think of that divorce as a chance to grow personally and develop more new positive relationships. These can be friendships as well as romantic relationships. So make decisions carefully after divorce, realizing that the consequences of your decisions regarding your work, lovers, and children might last the rest of your life. So this is relevant too before anybody gets in a serious long-term relationship. Focus more on the future than the past. So think about what's most important for you going forward in life. Set some goals and plan to reach them. And that's really good advice for anyone from childhood on, is to set some really important, meaningful, challenging goals and then set steps for how to reach those. Maybe it's getting a degree, getting this job, getting a better relationship with your parent, something like that. So use the strengths that you do have and the resources that you do have to cope with difficulties. because other things like close friends or close family can be protective factors against some of the risk factors from divorce. So for gay and lesbian adults, it's actually very, very similar in early adulthood in the relationships, the satisfaction, as well as conflict as well. So we've talked about how masculine and feminine roles for LGBTQ plus people are relatively uncommon, so it's a lot more egalitarian on average, and how very few in the gay male population have a large number of sexual partners, as well as for the lesbian population. So generally, people that are LGBTQ plus also prefer long-term committed relationships. So even though, yeah, I mean, it's not too surprising to me, like they're still looking for someone to be committed to, someone to be intimate with, someone to be passionate with over the long term. So they want to have that love. So pretty simple, I think. So Gottman's practices for making marriage work are pretty useful, and they can be, a lot of these points can be translated to friendships as well, even though your book is focusing on romantic relationships and, say, a marriage, for example. So establishing love maps. So what that means is sharing your feelings, them sharing their feelings, understanding what a person needs to feel loved, and then doing things to make that person feel loved in the way that they feel loved. So if they feel loved by getting more time with you, spend more time with them. If they feel loved by getting notes, give them more notes. If they feel loved by getting gifts, give gifts. So, I mean, maybe not expensive gifts, but things that show that you've been thinking and caring about them, right? So nurture fondness and admiration. So to do that, do things like praising each other. Look back at your history as positive, even if it's something that was hard that happened. Look back and pick out positive things. Be like, I admire you for the way you handled this. So, and let them know that you're admiring things about them. Praise them for things that they've done. So when things do get hard, turn towards each other rather than away from each other. So friendship between partners is essential. This is important for friendships as well. So when things get hard, turn towards each other. So let's say one of the partners in a couple loses a job, or any other hard thing happens, right? Rather than going and focusing on their other friends, coming together and working on it together will build more strength and help that relationship get stronger. So seek support from that partner. Appreciate the partner's point of view, even if you disagree with it. So try to come together to work through those challenges, coming to compromises, those kinds of things. Appreciate their view and where it's coming from. Appreciate them, even if you don't agree with their view. So let that partner influence you as well. So share power in that relationship. So some relationships might have a power differential. Try to make that more equal. So share power, respect their point of view. Don't be domineering or authoritarian. And also don't stand for that if that's what's happening as well. You've got to share that power. You've got to be a partnership. Right? You've got to let that person influence you. You want to be influencing them. You want to be working together as a partnership to overcome these kinds of challenges that you might have. So creating shared meaning is useful, and this goes back to a couple of the other points. Talk to each other respectfully and candidly. Find things that are meaningful to share together. So if things like watching How I Met Your Mother is meaningful to both of you, do that. Share that time with each other, right? If something like going for walks or hikes or going camping is meaningful, I'm picking out things that are specifically meaningful to me as examples. Do those things together. Share those times. Motorcycle rides, up a canyon, those kinds of things. So make meaning together from the hard times and the good. So one of the most annoying things that I ever experience in life is moving. So literally packing up all your stuff, moving to a new location, especially now with kids. It's a lot more difficult than it was earlier on in life. But it's a hard time to move to a new location, starting new jobs, going to new schools, those kinds of things. That can be hard. But if you work together with the partner, I've always found that my partner and I, we've always come closer through those, even though we might have a few challenges and maybe a few extra fights than usual during those times. So also sharing goals with a partner and help them work towards their goals. So what are the goals of your partner? If you're intimate with that person and sharing about yourself and they're sharing about themselves, you should know their goals. So help them reach those. So that's important too, is making sure, and that's part of that shared power. If you have shared resources, then you say, okay, so we're allotting X amount of time for you to work towards becoming the best acoustic guitar player in the world, or to getting your PhD, or to getting your master's degree, or to getting a promotion at work, to getting to the next level of this thing. So share those goals and work together. Find shared meaning together, things that you both find meaningful, and then do those things. So sounds simple, but these are research proven aspects that will build relationships through challenges. So let's talk about becoming a parent. So oftentimes in early adulthood, people will become parents. So most parenting practices, this is one of the least fun facts that I know as a developmental scientist. Most parenting practices are actually passed down and learned from your own parents. So you might, as a person who is a new parent, you might change or discard some of those parenting practices, but it's more of an evolution of those parenting practices rather than a dramatic shift. So as I look back towards how my parents parented me versus how I know my parents were parented and even how their parents were parented, I can see kind of an evolution of these practices. And so at least for me, it becomes really frustrating because I'm a developmental scientist. I know parenting, or I feel like I know a little bit about how parenting should work from the book side of it, but then implementing that can be really tough. I definitely default to the things that were passed down and learned from my parents. So that can be a frustrating thing for me as a human parent rather than just as a professor. As a professor, I'm like, I know all this stuff. I should be able to do it better. So with that as well, partners can often have a different parenting style, and that can cause conflict. So if you've got a parent or if one of these parents was parented with a really authoritarian versus one was parented with authoritative versus someone was parented with permissive, those parenting styles might cause conflict between the partners of these children. So there are a couple parenting myths I wanted to cover. So the birth of a child will save a failing marriage tends not to be the case statistically on average. That just doesn't happen. With children will think, feel, and behave like the parents did in their childhoods. This is often called, say, like the mother's curse. So, oh, well, you were really rambunctious, so your child's going to be really rambunctious too. That can happen, but children are their own human beings. They will think, they will feel, they will behave differently than their parents did, and similar in some ways. I know my kids look in many ways identical to my wife, but they are personality-wise a really strange mix of both of us, and both of them are very different from each other. So they think, feel, and behave very differently than I did or my wife did in our childhoods. That having a child gives the parents a second chance at achievement. Some parents try to do this to have their children carry on a legacy or be better than they were, and those as they're on their own aren't really a bad goal. I think a really good example of this is when I was a teenager, I participated in a local rodeo where I got to ride basically a calf. I forget, like 12, 13, so small, so it wasn't like a full-size bull, it was a smaller cow. And before me, there was a kid who was probably a year younger than me, and so just barely old enough to ride the cow versus like a sheep or a goat or something like that in the rodeo pen. And the father was yelling at this child because he had been a rodeo rider. What I gathered from these 2 minutes of hearing the father was that he had been a rodeo rider, but he had broken his hip, so he had a really serious injury and he couldn't continue, and he really wanted his child to achieve greater heights in that area. Children, like we said a minute ago, think, feel, and behave differently than their parents did, and they'll have different goals, their own things that they're interested in, their own things that they're passionate about. So it doesn't generally give parents a second chance at achievement. So another myth is that parenting is an instinct and requires no training. it goes back to a lot of our parenting practices just kind of come along with what we experience as children ourselves. So it's definitely not an instinct. It requires training. The more training, I don't know if I can say the more training, the better. There might be a point of diminishing returns there. But definitely it's not something that's instinctual. That'd be great if it was. Childbirth trends. So with that, the average age for a first-time mother is 27 years old. In 2016, for the first time, more U.S. women were giving birth in their 30s than in their 20s. We'll talk about later on, giving birth into the 40s can be dangerous for both the mother and the children, but we'll talk about that in a later chapter. So by giving birth to fewer children and reducing the demands of childcare, women free up a significant portion of their lifespan for other endeavors. So generally, there's still a lot of focus on women being mothers and in a home taking care of children. So that has changed a little, and it definitely frees up time for women to set their own goals and achieve things that they want to other than just being a mother. So with that, men are also more likely to invest a greater amount of time in fathering than they were in decades past. Parental care is often supplemented by institutional care. So if you've got to both work or you both want to work, then the child's going to need to be cared with by someone. So a lot more institutional care. And that is the end of this chapter. So that was chapter 12 on socio-emotional development in early adulthood. So a lot of it does focus, because most of this is coming from your book, so it does focus a lot on romantic relationships. Some of the other resources that I provide you go into friendships, but a lot of these things do translate to building good, strong friendships in early adulthood too, which I think is a really important thing that should be included in the book, and so I try to supplement with that additional material. But a lot of these aspects that we talked about today with love are also relevant to family relationships too. So I hope you learned some things that can be useful to you, because I know a lot of the students are in this early adult period. So I think it's a really useful chapter talking about the socio-emotional development and how to build relationships. I think it's a really useful one, and I like teaching about it. So hopefully it was useful as well.